The air on October 15th, 1888, carried a warning that the old men of Providence chose to ignore. It was a brittleness, a sharp, crystalline quality that stripped the warmth from the autumn sun and left a chill deep in the bone. The woolly caterpillars wore unusually thick coats. The bark on the north side of the oaks was heavier than in living memory, and the squirrels moved with a frantic, desperate energy. These were the old signs, the language of the land that Alara Vance's grandfather had taught her to read. The town elders, men of property and position, preferred the language of the almanac and the reassurances of their own past experiences. Alara Vance was 19 years old. She had been a wife for 2 years and a widow for 1. Her husband, Thomas, had been taken by a collapse in the silver mine that gave the town its name and its precarious purpose. Her parents were long gone, claimed by fever when she was a child. She was utterly alone, left with a small, mortgaged plot of land on the windswept southern edge of town and a collection of her grandfather's journals, filled with observations on weather patterns, botany, and engineering principles that most considered eccentric nonsense. It was in those journals that she found the plan. As the signs of a brutal winter accumulated, she felt a dread that was colder than the air itself. The town's 47 families were hardy, but their preparations were based on the predictable hardships of a normal, high-country winter. They laid in stores of firewood, salted meat, and flour, confident in the thick log walls of their cabins and the comforting authority of their town council. Alara saw a flaw in their confidence, a catastrophic vulnerability they refused to acknowledge. A normal winter could be weathered. The winter that was coming, she felt with chilling certainty, would not be normal. It would be a siege. She requested a hearing at the monthly town meeting, held in the drafty, single-room structure that served as both church and public hall. When her turn came, she stood before the 30 men who constituted the town's voting populace. Her voice was steady, devoid of the pleading or hysteria they might have expected from a young widow. She spoke not of omens or premonitions, but of thermodynamics and observation. "The signs suggest a winter of unprecedented severity," she began, her hands clasped before her. "Our firewood stores will not be sufficient. Our homes, for all their strength, will lose heat faster than we can generate it when the temperatures fall to 40 below and the winds exceed 60 miles an hour. Livestock will perish. The snows will be deep enough to make travel between houses impossible. We will be isolated, and we will freeze." A murmur went through the room. It was not a sound of concern, but of condescending amusement. Mayor Alistair Thornton, a portly man whose confidence was as expansive as his waistcoat, leaned forward on the rostrum. "My dear Alara," he said, his tone dripping with paternalistic pity, "we appreciate your concern, truly, but we men have been managing winters in these mountains for decades. My own house has stood for 30 years and has never failed to keep my family warm. We trust in solid timber and good sense, not in the anxieties of the young." "It is not anxiety, Mr. Thornton. It is an assessment of risk," Alara replied, her gaze unwavering. "I propose a communal solution, a shelter built into the earth itself to harness its constant temperature. A long trench dug into a south-facing slope, roofed with a glazed angle to capture the winter sun. We could create a space that requires minimal fuel to maintain a temperature well above freezing, a place where we could shelter the vulnerable, store excess food, and survive the worst of the storm together." Silas Croft, the blacksmith, let out a short, barking laugh. He was a mountain of a man, his forearms thick as fence posts, a man who believed any problem could be solved with enough sweat and iron. "A dirt hole? You want the good people of Providence to live like badgers in a burrow? My forge keeps my house warm, girl, and my walls are 2 feet of solid oak. No wind is getting through that. The wind will not have to get through the walls, Mr. Croft, Alara explained calmly. It will strip the heat from them. It is a matter of thermal transfer. The Earth, however, maintains a stable temperature of around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, just 8 feet below the surface. It is a thermal battery. We would not be fighting the cold. We would be borrowing the Earth's warmth. Reverend Michael Gable, a thin, severe man who saw divine judgment in every hardship, rose to his feet. The Lord sends us trials to test our faith, not to be circumvented by subterranean novelties. He provides the wood for our fires and the fortitude in our hearts. To hide from his winter is to doubt his providence. He made a point of stressing the last word, linking the town's name to his theological argument. The proposal was dead. The assembled men nodded in agreement with the mayor, the blacksmith, and the reverend. They represented the 3 pillars of their society: civic authority, practical industry, and moral certainty. Against such a trinity, the quiet logic of a 19-year-old widow stood no chance. Mayor Thornton officially dismissed her proposal with a final, patronizing pat on the head, figuratively speaking. Thank you for your civic spirit, Alara. Now, let us move on to the matter of the new bridge planking. Alara did not argue further. She had presented the facts, offered the solution, and been rebuffed. She had fulfilled her duty to the community. Now, her duty was to herself. As the men debated lumber prices, she slipped out of the hall and walked back to her small plot of land. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and blood orange. It was a beautiful, terrible sunset. She looked at the gentle, south-facing slope behind her small cabin, the one her grandfather had always said was a gift from the sun. The town had made its decision. Now she would make hers. On October 18th, 1888, Alara Vance began to dig. She did not own a horse or an ox. Her tools were a sturdy spade, a heavy pickaxe, and a battered wheelbarrow that had belonged to her husband. Her resources consisted of her own unyielding determination and the $47 in silver coins she had saved. Her guide was her grandfather's journal, open to a page of detailed schematics and calculations under the heading, The Subterranean Conservatory or Winter Haven. The first step was the survey. Following the journal's instructions, she used wooden stakes and twine to mark out a long rectangle on the slope. The dimensions were precise: 80 feet in length, oriented perfectly east to west, and 12 feet in width. The northern edge was flush with the steepest part of the slope, while the southern edge faced the open meadow and the low winter sun. The design was intended to maximize solar exposure while using the hill itself as a massive, insulating wall. The excavation was a brutal, solitary labor. The topsoil was thin, quickly giving way to dense, rocky clay. Each swing of the pickaxe jarred her arms and sent a shock through her shoulders. Each shovelful of earth felt impossibly heavy. She worked from dawn until dusk, her world shrinking to the rhythm of her tools and the growing pile of excavated dirt. The men of the town, riding past on their way to the mines or the forest, would sometimes stop and watch. Some offered pitying smiles. Others, like Silas Croft, openly scoffed at the sight of her toil. "Digging your own grave, Alara?" he called out one afternoon. She did not grace him with a response, merely pausing to wipe the sweat from her brow before driving the pickaxe back into the stubborn earth. She was methodical. The floor of the trench was not level. It sloped gently from both ends down to the center, creating a shallow basin. The depth varied, from 8 feet at the east and west ends to a final depth of 10 feet in the middle. Her grandfather's notes explained this was crucial for cold air drainage. The coldest air would settle in the lowest point, away from the areas where plants and people would be. She hauled the excavated earth with the wheelbarrow, dumping it not in a random pile, but carefully banking it against the exposed northern, eastern, and western sides of the trench, creating thick earthen berms that would add yet another layer of insulation. This process alone took her 3 weeks of relentless, back-breaking work. By the middle of November, the trench was complete. It was a stark, geometric wound in the hillside. Now came the construction of the walls. She could not afford lumber for the entire structure, nor did she want it. The journal specified a technique her grandfather had observed among the peoples of the high desert: rammed earth. She spent days testing soil compositions, mixing the clay-rich subsoil she had excavated with sand from a nearby creek bed and a small, carefully measured amount of lime, which she had been forced to purchase for a sum of $4. She built wooden forms, simple panels of scrap lumber held together with rope and wedges. Into these forms, she shoveled the damp earth mixture in 6-inch layers. Then, using a heavy wooden tamper she had fashioned from a log, she compacted each layer until it was dense and rock hard. It was a slow, exhausting process. Fill the form, tamp. Fill, tamp. Again and again. Once a section was complete, she would remove the forms and move them to the adjacent spot, leaving behind a wall of solid, layered earth, 2 feet thick. These walls rose from the trench floor to ground level on the east, west, and south sides. The north wall was the hill itself, a sheer face of undisturbed, insulating soil. As she worked, the weather turned colder. The first snows came, light dustings that melted by midday, but served as a constant reminder of the closing window of time. She worked through the cold, her hands raw and chapped, her muscles aching with a fatigue so deep it felt permanent. She ate little, mostly dried jerky and hard biscuits, saving her energy for the task at hand. She felt a strange sense of clarity in her exhaustion. The scorn of the town had faded into an irrelevant background noise. All that mattered was the work, the precise execution of the plan laid out in the journal. With the walls complete, she began the most critical part of the structure, the roof. This was where her small savings were spent. She purchased rough-sawn timber from the town's small mill, costing her $21. She could not afford the services of the town carpenter, so she learned to cut the joints herself, using a handsaw and a chisel, her grandfather's diagrams as her guide. The design was a simple shed roof, but the angle was paramount. It had to be pitched at a precise 60-degree angle from the horizontal, calculated to be perfectly perpendicular to the rays of the midwinter sun at their latitude. This would ensure that the maximum amount of solar energy entered the structure and the minimum amount was reflected away. The main support beams were heavy timbers, set into the top of the rammed earth walls and anchored deep into the earthen bank of the north slope. Laying these beams was the most dangerous part of the construction. She used a simple lever and fulcrum system to hoist one end at a time, inching them into place with a combination of leverage, gravity, and sheer willpower. There were moments when a beam would slip, threatening to crush her, but she moved with a deliberation that bordered on grace, her focus absolute. For the glazing, she could not afford glass. A single pane from the general store cost more than all her lumber. Her grandfather's journal offered an alternative. She purchased several bolts of the cheapest, tightest weave linen she could find at a cost of $3.50. She built rectangular wooden frames, 80 of them in total, each 2 feet wide and 4 feet long. She stretched the linen across these frames as tightly as a drumhead, securing it with tacks. Then, In the evenings, by candlelight in her small cabin, she meticulously painted each panel with boiled linseed oil, a smelly, sticky task. She applied 3 coats, letting each one dry completely. The oil rendered the fabric translucent and waterproof, creating a durable, shatterproof pane that would allow about 60% of the available sunlight to pass through. By the first week of December, the roof was framed and the translucent panels were ready. She installed them one by one, overlapping them like shingles and sealing the joints with a mixture of pine tar and tallow. The interior of the structure was transformed. What had been a dark, earthen scar was now filled with a soft, diffused, golden light. Even on a cloudy day, it was bright enough to read by. The final construction cost for nails, lime, lumber, linen, and oil came to $29.75. The final elements of the design were focused on managing the captured energy. Against the solid earth of the back wall, she built a lower, thicker wall of stacked stone, mortared with clay. This was the thermal mass wall, the heat sink. During the day, it would absorb the direct sunlight that struck it, and at night, it would slowly radiate that stored heat back into the space. She also hauled in 4 large wooden barrels, which had cost her another $2, filled them with water, and placed them along the back wall. Water, the journal noted, was an exceptionally efficient medium for storing thermal energy. For ventilation, she created 2 shafts, a low intake vent on the southern wall near the floor, and a high exhaust vent on the northern wall near the roof peak. These would allow for passive air circulation, preventing the buildup of stale air and excess humidity. The entrance was a small, insulated door on the east side, but it did not open directly to the outside. Instead, it opened into a small, sunken entryway, a cold sink designed so that when the door was opened, the heavier, cold outside air would pool in the lower entry rather than flooding the main living space. A second inner door completed the airlock. Her work was not yet done. The structure was a shell. It needed to be a haven. She partitioned a small area at the western end for living quarters, building a simple cot and a small, highly efficient wood stove with a chimney that vented through the roof. The stove was not for primary heating, the sun and earth provided that, but for cooking and for providing supplemental heat during long, sunless periods. She laid in a modest but carefully calculated supply of firewood, far less than her neighbors were hoarding, knowing each log would be used with maximum efficiency. The remaining 70 feet of the structure was dedicated to survival. She turned the rich soil of the floor into long planting beds. Using seeds saved from her summer garden, she planted cold-hardy greens, kale, spinach, chard, and mâche. In the relatively warm, protected environment, they would grow slowly but steadily through the winter, providing a source of fresh food that would be unthinkable for anyone else in Providence. She moved her stores of preserved food from her cabin's root cellar into the shelter. Jars of beans, sacks of flour and potatoes, salted pork, and dried apples. On December 18th, 1876, she moved in. She brought her grandfather's journals, a few books, a lantern, and a thermometer. The outside air temperature that day was 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the completed winter haven, with the sun shining, the thermometer read a comfortable 65 degrees. That night, as the temperature outside plummeted to 5 below zero, the interior of the shelter slowly dropped to a low of 52 degrees, the thermal mass of the earth and the stone wall radiating their stored warmth. It was a success. She had built a pocket of temperate climate in the heart of a brutal winter. She was ready. The town paid her no mind. Her project, which had been a source of summer amusement and autumn mockery, was forgotten as the real business of winter began. The first heavy snows arrived just after Christmas, blanketing the town in a pristine, 3-foot layer of white. It was a beautiful, traditional winter scene. Families gathered around their roaring fires, confident and secure. The men praised their own foresight in laying in such large stocks of wood. Mayor Thornton publicly declared that the town was more than prepared for whatever nature had in store. They felt the deep satisfaction of people whose conventional wisdom had, in their minds, been affirmed. January was colder. The temperature rarely rose above zero, and the snow continued to fall, adding another 2 feet to the drifts. The wind became a constant scouring presence, whining around the corners of the log cabins and driving fine, powdery snow through the smallest of cracks. The town's consumption of firewood doubled. Silas Croft, whose forge was now working day and night just to keep his own home habitable, had to start rationing the wood he sold to others. The price of a cord of wood, if one could even be found, tripled. The first signs of strain began to show. Alara, meanwhile, lived in quiet comfort. Her small stove consumed only a few logs each day, mainly for cooking her evening meal of potato and kale soup. During the day, sunlight streamed through the oiled linen panels, warming the air and nourishing the vibrant green shoots in her garden beds. She spent her days tending her plants, reading her grandfather's books on geology and engineering, and mending her clothes. The roar of the wind outside was a distant, muted sound, a threat that could not touch her. She was an island of warmth and life in a world that was slowly, inexorably freezing. The storm that would be known as the Great White Death arrived without warning on the morning of January 12, 1889. It did not begin as snow, but as a sky the color of a leaden bruise and a sudden, terrifying drop in barometric pressure that made one's ears pop. Then the wind came, a solid wall of force that hit the town like a physical blow. It was not a gale, it was a terrestrial hurricane, a relentless, shrieking onslaught that the oldest residents had never imagined possible. The temperature, which had been holding at a bitter -10 degrees, plunged. Within an hour, it was -30. By nightfall, it was -45, not accounting for a wind chill that was simply beyond measurement or comprehension. Then came the snow. It was not snow as they knew it. It was fine, hard, and granular, like sand, and it was driven horizontally by the wind. It did not fall, it attacked. It blasted against the walls of the cabins, finding and exploiting every chink in the chinking, every crack in the window frames. It poured into attics and under doors, accumulating in ghostly, serpentine drifts inside the houses themselves. The world outside vanished into a blinding, featureless vortex of white. Visibility was reduced to zero. To step outside was to be instantly lost, to have the breath stolen from your lungs, to have your skin frozen in seconds. Inside Mayor Thornton's large, well-appointed house, the mood shifted from confidence to concern, and then to fear. The great stone fireplace, which had always been a symbol of his prosperity, was now a ravenous beast, consuming logs at an impossible rate. Yet the heat it produced was immediately snatched away. The walls of the house groaned and popped under the strain of the cold. A fine layer of frost began to form on the interior walls, tracing the lines of the logs. His wife and 3 children were huddled together under a pile of blankets, their breath pluming in the air. The temperature inside the main room, just 10 feet from the fire, was 20 degrees. At Silas Croft's home, the situation was grimmer. His iron stove, a model of efficiency in a normal winter, was no match for the supernatural cold. He was feeding it split logs as fast as he could, but the metal sides of the stove were barely warm to the touch. The immense thermal energy was being wicked away into the frozen air. His wife was weeping silently, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had turned to ice before she could drink it. Croft, the man of iron and fire, felt a cold dread creep into his heart. He looked at his dwindling woodpile and knew, with mathematical certainty, that it would not last the night. In the small house next to the church, Reverend Gable led his family in prayer. He prayed for deliverance, for a reprieve from this divine test. But the wind only shrieked louder, mocking his words. The single pane of glass in his window, a luxury he had prided himself on, suddenly cracked with a sound like a pistol shot, a spiderweb of fractures appearing in an instant. Then, with a soft pop, the entire pane disintegrated, and the storm was inside. A torrent of snow and wind blasted into the room, extinguishing their lantern and plunging them into freezing darkness. Faith, he discovered, was a poor insulator. For 2 days the storm raged without pause. The town of Providence ceased to exist as a community. It became a collection of isolated, freezing tombs. The firewood ran out. The food began to freeze solid in the pantries. The terrifying sound of structural timbers contracting and splitting in the cold echoed in the darkness. The first casualty was an elderly couple whose roof, overloaded with a massive, wind-carved drift, collapsed, burying them in an instant. The second was a child, succumbing to hypothermia in his own bed. On the morning of the third day, a moment of terrible clarity arrived for Alastair Thornton. The fire was out. The last of the wood was gone. The temperature inside his house was now 5 degrees below zero. His youngest daughter was listless, her skin pale and waxy. He looked at his wife, her face a mask of despair, and he knew they would be dead by nightfall. And in that moment of absolute desperation, a memory surfaced through the fog of his pride. A young woman, speaking calmly of thermal mass and a shelter dug into the earth. The badger's burrow, the folly, the absurd dirt hole. It was their only hope. The decision was not made with words. It was a shared glance of primal fear between Thornton and his wife. He pulled on every layer of clothing he owned, wrapping his face in scarves until only his eyes were visible. He would go to Silas Croft and Reverend Gable first. They lived closest. They would go together. He opened his front door and was met with a solid wall of snow. He had to tunnel through it, clawing his way out like an animal, emerging into a nightmare landscape. The wind tore at him, and the cold was a physical pain, a crushing weight on his chest. He could not see more than 3 feet in front of him. He navigated by memory alone, stumbling through drifts that were over his head, pulling himself along the frozen outlines of fences he could feel but not see. He reached Croft's house to find the blacksmith in a similar state of desperation. Their conversation was a shouted exchange of just a few words over the roar of the wind. "Elara's place!" Croft nodded, his face grim, and gathered his own family. Together, they fought their way to the Reverend's house, where they found Gable and his family huddled in the one room that still had a roof, their faith shattered by the brutal reality of the cold. There was no argument, no debate. The hierarchy of the town had dissolved. They were no longer a mayor, a blacksmith, and a minister. They were just 10 terrified people on the verge of freezing to death. The journey to Elara's property, a distance of less than 400 yards, was an epic struggle for survival. They tied themselves together with a rope from Croft's workshop so they would not be separated and lost in the whiteout. Mayor Thornton led the way, his portly frame acting as a snowplow, creating a path for the women and children who followed. The wind drove the ice sand of the snow into their eyes, and the cold burned their exposed skin. Every breath was an agony. After what felt like an eternity of struggle, they stumbled into the lee of the hill where Elara's land lay. They could see nothing, but Thornton remembered the general location. They began to sweep back and forth, their feet probing through the deep snow, searching for any sign of the structure. It was Croft who found it. His boot hit something solid, the top of a small wooden door, barely visible above a massive drift. He let out a hoarse cry of relief and began to dig frantically with his frostbitten hands. The others joined him, clawing away the snow until they had cleared the small, sunken entryway. The simple wooden door was frozen shut. Croft, using the last of his immense strength, put his shoulder to it and heaved. The frozen hinges screamed, and with a crack, the door flew open, revealing a second door just beyond it. Thornton fumbled with the latch, his fingers numb and useless. He finally managed to push it open, and they fell inside, a heap of snow-caked, half-frozen humanity, into the antechamber. The first thing they noticed was the silence. The deafening, soul-crushing roar of the wind was gone, replaced by a profound and absolute quiet. The second was the air. It was not warm, not by the standards of a summer day, but compared to the lethal cold they had just escaped, it felt like a tropical balm. It was humid and smelled of damp earth, of green, growing things. As Thornton pushed himself to his feet and looked through the inner doorway, he saw a sight so unbelievable it seemed like a hallucination. The long, subterranean corridor was bathed in a soft, ethereal light filtering through the snow-covered roof panels. Along the floor, rows of vibrant green plants grew from the dark earth, glistening with moisture. The air was a steady 55 degrees, and there, at the far end, sitting at a small wooden table with a book open before her, was Alara Vance. She looked up, her expression calm, unsurprised. She was wearing a simple wool dress, no coat, no hat. She looked as if she were enjoying a quiet afternoon in early autumn. She rose without a word and came toward them. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not gloat. She did not demand an apology. Her face showed only a quiet, somber compassion. She saw their frost-bitten cheeks, the ice in their beards, the terror in the children's eyes. She simply began to minister to them, handing out thick wool blankets she had stored, ladling hot broth from a pot simmering on her small stove into tin cups, and showing them where to sit, away from the door, where the air was warmest. The 10 refugees, the leaders of Providence and their families, huddled together in the blankets, sipping the life-giving broth. They looked around the winter haven with a sense of awe and profound shame. They saw the elegant simplicity of its design, the genius of its execution, the massive stone wall radiating a gentle warmth, the barrels of water, ice-free, the rows of life-giving food. It was not a dirt hole. It was not a grave. It was an ark. They had mocked her, dismissed her, and patronized her, and she had responded by building the one thing, the only thing, that could save them from their own arrogance. For another day and a half, the blizzard continued its assault on the world above. Inside the shelter, a strange new society took shape. Ilara was its unquestioned center, moving with quiet efficiency, rationing the food, tending to the children, checking the ventilation shafts to ensure they remained clear. The mayor, the blacksmith, and the reverend were her dependents. Their authority, built on wealth, strength, and dogma, had been rendered meaningless. Here, the only authority that mattered was competence. The only wisdom that mattered was the kind that kept them alive. They spoke little, their earlier pronouncements and certainties now tasting like ash in their mouths. Not one of them had lost a family member in the first days of the storm. Not one had burned through their entire wood supply before the second day, and not one, in the warm, quiet safety of the shelter, would admit they had been so catastrophically wrong. But their silence was an admission in itself, a heavy, suffocating blanket of humility. On the morning of January 15th, an unfamiliar silence woke them. The wind had stopped. After 4 days of constant, deafening noise, the quiet was jarring. Alara unsealed the outer door and pushed it open. The world that greeted them was utterly transformed. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the sun shone down on a landscape of impossible white. The snow lay in immense sculpted drifts, some as high as the rooftops of the cabins. The town of Providence was gone, buried. Only a few stovepipes and the peak of the church steeple were visible to mark its location. When they finally managed to tunnel their way back to the town proper, the true cost of their folly was revealed. The silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of the grave. Of the 47 families in Providence, 17 had not survived. Some had been lost to collapsed roofs. Others had simply frozen in their beds when their fires died. The survivors were gaunt, frostbitten, and traumatized. They emerged from their buried homes like ghosts, their confidence shattered, their world destroyed. In the weeks that followed, the community did not look to Mayor Thornton for leadership. They did not seek the counsel of Reverend Gable or the strength of Silas Croft. They came, one by one, to the small plot of land on the edge of town, to the entrance of the Winter Haven. They came for food from Alara's subterranean garden. They came for advice on how to rebuild. They came to listen to the quiet, 19-year-old widow who had read the land while they had read their almanacs. The woman who had trusted in forgotten knowledge while they had trusted in their own pride. Alara's vindication was absolute, but it was not triumphant. There was no joy in it. Every time she looked at the new graves in the town cemetery, she felt the heavy weight of what could have been. She had offered them all a place in her ark, and they had refused. Now, she was left to lead the survivors. The Winter Haven became the new center of the town, a communal storehouse and a testament to a different kind of wisdom. The story of its creation and of the great white death that had made it necessary became the founding legend of the rebuilt Providence, a somber, cautionary tale about the terrible price of being right too soon, and the profound, life-giving power of listening to a voice that others choose to ignore. She had not changed. She had remained constant, a fixed point of logic and foresight. It was the world around her that had been forced by the brutal hand of nature to irrevocably and tragically change its mind.